The rain in Blackwood Bay didn't fall. It drifted in a salty, gray mist that got under your skin and stayed there. It was a place of rusted shipwrecks and people who wanted to be forgotten. David wasn't there to be forgotten. He was there to find his sister, Sarah. She had moved to the coast 6 months ago for a research job at a private marine station. Her letters had been frequent, filled with sketches of tide pools and descriptions of the local fog. Then, 3 weeks ago, they stopped. No phone calls, no emails, just a final cryptic postcard with a picture of a lighthouse and one sentence: "The water remembers everything." David stood in front of a rented cottage, a shack perched on rotting stilts over the mudflats. The padlock on the door had been forced open, not by a crowbar, but by something heavy and blunt. Inside, the cottage was freezing. It smelled of brine and wet wool. David flicked his flashlight around the room. Sarah's journals were gone. Her laptop was gone. But on the kitchen table sat a single glass of water, filled to the brim. Next to it was a small, perfectly round stone from the beach. He pulled out his phone. No signal. There was never a signal in Blackwood. David headed down to the Anchor, the only pub in town. It was a low-ceilinged room filled with the smell of old tobacco and fried fish. The locals stopped talking the moment he stepped inside. "I'm looking for Sarah Thorne," David said, sliding a photo across the bar. "She lived in the cottage on the flats." The bartender, a man whose face looked like a crumpled map, didn't even look at the photo. "Cottage is empty, lad. Has been for a month." "That's impossible," David countered, his voice tight. "I have a postcard from her dated 2 weeks ago." A man in the corner, wearing a faded yellow fisherman's slicker, looked up. His eyes were milky with cataracts, but he seemed to be looking right through David. "The tide took her," the old man rasped. "The station don't like visitors, and the water don't like secrets." Before David could ask what the station was, the man stood up and walked out into the rain. David couldn't sleep. He stayed in a small motel at the edge of town, the walls so thin he could hear the Atlantic pounding the shore like a rhythmic drum. At 2:14 a.m., a sound woke him. A wet, dragging noise right outside his door. Slap, drag, slap, drag. He gripped a heavy flashlight and crept to the window. In the pale moonlight, he saw a trail of dark, wet sand leading from the beach straight to his door. And there, standing at the edge of the parking lot, was the man in the yellow slicker. He wasn't moving. He was just pointing toward the northern cliffs where the ruins of the old Victorian lighthouse stood. The same lighthouse from Sarah's last postcard. David threw on his jacket and grabbed his car keys. But when he tried to start his engine, it just sputtered. He popped the hood. Every single wire had been meticulously cut. Not shredded, cut. Someone didn't want him to leave. But more importantly, someone didn't want him to drive. They wanted him to walk. Into the dark. Into the salt. David didn't wait for dawn. Carrying a heavy wrench from his car's trunk and his flashlight, he began the 3-mile trek toward the northern cliffs. The path was a narrow ribbon of crumbling limestone. Below, the Atlantic surged, white foam looking like bared teeth in the darkness. The lighthouse wasn't a romantic ruin. It was a tomb of rusted iron and shattered glass. As David approached, he noticed something odd. The ground around the base was cleared of weeds. There were fresh tire tracks in the mud. Wide, heavy treads of a luxury SUV, totally out of place in this impoverished fishing village. He stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and expensive cleaning supplies, bleach. He climbed the spiral staircase, his boots echoing like gunshots. On the 3rd floor, he found a small room that had been converted into a makeshift office. It was surgically clean, except for one thing. A small, silver earring lying under a metal radiator. David picked it up. His stomach dropped. He had bought these for Sarah's graduation. There was dried blood on the clasp. Then he heard the floorboards creak behind him. David spun around, swinging the wrench, but he stopped mid-motion. Standing in the doorway wasn't a weathered fisherman or a crazed cultist. It was a man in a charcoal gray suit, looking as if he'd just stepped out of a boardroom in London. "You were always the impulsive one, David," the man said softly. David's breath hitched. Mark? Mark was Sarah's ex-fiancé, a high-level consultant for a pharmaceutical conglomerate. David had always thought Mark was a bit cold, but he was family, or he had been until Sarah broke off the engagement a year ago. "What are you doing here, Mark? Where is she?" Mark sighed, stepping into the room. Two men in tactical gear appeared behind him, their faces obscured by shadows. "Sarah didn't move here for research, David. She moved here to hide. She stole something from the firm, data that belongs to people who don't understand the word no. I was sent to facilitate its return." "You kidnapped her," David whispered, the reality hitting him harder than the cold wind outside. "You didn't come to help her. You tracked her down." "I came to save her life," Mark corrected, his voice devoid of emotion. "If I didn't find her first, the firm would have sent people far less polite than me. But she's stubborn. She won't tell me where the drives are." "Where is she, Mark? Tell me right now, or I swear to God." David started forward, but one of the men in shadows stepped in, a flash of taser light illuminating the room. David hit the floor, his muscles seizing in an agonizing white heat. When he could breathe again, he was tied to a heavy wooden chair. Mark was sitting across from him, looking at Sarah's final postcard. "The water remembers everything," Mark read aloud. "That's not poetry, David. That's a location. There's an old diving bell submerged about 200 yards off the pier. She hid the data there, didn't she? She knew you'd eventually figure it out." "I don't know what you're talking about," David gasped, his tongue feeling like lead. Mark leaned in close. "I think you do. And I think if I start making Sarah scream in the room downstairs, your memory will improve very quickly." A muffled cry echoed from beneath the floorboards. It was Sarah. She wasn't at a station or a research facility. She had been right here, 3 floors down, listening to David arrive. Mark stood up and signaled to his men. "Bring her up. Let's see how much brotherly love is worth in Bitcoin." The door to the room creaked open and the 2 men dragged Sarah in. She was a ghost of her former self, her hair matted with salt, her face bruised, but her eyes, when they met David's, were burning with a fierce, cold intelligence. "David," she whispered. Her voice was a broken rasp. "I'm sorry, Sarah," David choked out, struggling against the zip ties cutting into his wrists. "I followed the postcard." Mark knelt between them, holding a small, encrypted tablet. "Enough reunions. The diving bell, Sarah. The tide is coming in. In 2 hours, that bell will be 30 feet under churning silt. If my divers don't have the coordinates now, they'll never find it. And if they don't find it, neither of you leaves this lighthouse." Sarah looked at David, then at Mark. A small, bloody smile touched her lips. "The coordinates are on the stone, Mark. The one I left in the cottage." Mark stiffened. He signaled one of his men, who spoke into a radio. "The stone in the cottage. Get it, now." While the men were distracted, Sarah leaned toward David. "The wrench," she breathed, almost silent. David felt it. He had dropped the heavy iron wrench right next to his chair when he was tasered. It was inches from his foot. 20 minutes later, the radio crackled. "Sir, we have the stone. There's a micro-engraving on the base. We're heading to the pier." Mark stood up, smoothing his suit. "You see, everyone has a price. Usually, it's just the life of someone they love." He turned to his guards. "Clean this up. Make it look like a tragic accident. A brother and sister swept off the cliffs by a rogue wave. Very common in Blackwood Bay." Mark turned to leave, but he made a mistake. he walked too close to David. In one explosive movement, David hooked the wrench with his boot, flipped it into his bound hands, and lunged. He didn't go for Mark. He swung the heavy iron with all his might at the gas-powered heater in the corner of the room. The valve snapped. The hiss of pressurized propane filled the small space instantly. "Sarah, run!" David screamed. One of the guards pulled a gun, but Mark shouted, "Don't shoot! You'll blow us all to hell!" In the chaos, Sarah dived through the doorway. She had spent months exploring this lighthouse. She knew the service chute in the hallway. David, still tied to the chair, kicked the guard in the knee and threw his weight against the door, jamming the wrench into the handle from the inside. David was trapped inside with Mark and the two guards. The room was thick with gas. Outside, he could hear Sarah's frantic footsteps fading as she scrambled down the rocks toward the hidden boat she had kept for her escape. Mark's face was pale, his composure gone. "David, open the door. We can all walk out. I'll let her go, I swear." David sat back in his chair, his heart rate slowing down. Through the window, he could see a single light on the water, Sarah's boat. She was moving. She was safe. "You don't get it, Mark," David said, his voice calm, almost peaceful. "You're the architect of absence, but today, you're just another secret for the water to keep." He reached into his pocket. He didn't have a lighter. He didn't need one. He grabbed the heavy industrial flashlight he had been carrying. The casing was cracked from the struggle. "Sarah has the data," David whispered, "and she has your signature on the lease of this station. You're done." David flicked the switch on the broken flashlight. A tiny internal spark jumped across the damaged wiring. The explosion was a brief, brilliant star on the northern cliffs of Blackwood Bay. From her boat, a mile out at sea, Sarah watched the top of the lighthouse vanish into a plume of orange fire and falling stone. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She gripped the tiller of the boat until her knuckles turned white. In her pocket was the real drive. The diving bell was empty, a decoy for a man who thought he was smarter than he was. "The water remembers everything," David had once told her when they were children. As the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the Atlantic in shades of bruised purple and gold, Sarah turned the boat toward the open ocean. She was alive, but the cost was a hole in her world that the sea would never fill. Behind her, the lighthouse was silent. The mist returned, thick and gray, swallowing the ruins until it looked as if nothing had ever happened at all.